We move on to our next session, which is on what is our tomorrow, reading today, global trends in nonfiction for children. Please allow me to introduce the panelists of this talk. Our first speaker, Manisha Chaudhary, has many years of experience as a publishing professional and in the social development sector. She began her professional career in India's first feminist publishing house, Kali for Women, in 1986 and has been a consultant to a range of organizations in the development sector and the UN. An editor and translator fluent in Hindi and English, her work has been published by Kali for Women, Oxford University Press, Zuban Books, Yatra Books, Niyogi Books, Pratham Books, and Permanent Black. Her translation, A Street in Srinagar, of the Hindi novel Ailan Gali Zinda Hai by Chandrakanta, was shortlisted for the DSC Prize for Literature in 2012. Her most recent translation, The Chipko Movement, A People's History of Shekhar Pathak's Hari Bhari Ummeed, has been awarded the Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay Book Prize in 2022. Manisha was editorial head at Pratham Books, a not-for-profit multilingual children's publisher, since its inception until 2017. She is a severally published author of children's books and has translated numerous others. As one of the founder trustees of Bokaro Children's Literature Festival, she spearheaded the initiative of Bokaro in the city. The children's outreach of the Jaipur Literary Festival was started under her guidance. She has been advisor to the Kahani Festival and Jumpstart, a children's content congress run by the German Book Office. She is an invited member to the publishing committee of FICCI. She has been in the forefront of many new initiatives to democratize the joy of reading and books and improve quality in education. She works as an independent consultant for publishing and translation initiatives. Currently, she leads Jaipur Bookmark, the publishing segment of the Jaipur Literary Festival, and has recently concluded the Zuban Prabha Khaitan translation program. The other panelist, Dr. Anurima Chondo, is a writer, translator, and story explorer who teaches English at Birsa Munda College. She has traveled the world learning and sharing stories as a DAAD fellow in Germany, as a SUSI fellow in Montana, USA, and a Charles Wallace visiting fellow in Scotland. She has brought amazing tales to life with books like How I Became a Writer, Bejonma, and Women of India. When she is not reading or writing, she is dreaming up adventures, giving voices to untold stories, and inviting kids to imagine, create, and make the world a little brighter, one story at a time. The facilitator for this session is Dr. Gargi Gangopadhyay, Assistant Professor in the Department of English at Ramakrishna Sharda Mission, Vivekananda Vidya Bhavan. With over 24 years of teaching experience, including 8 years at the postgraduate level, Dr. Gangopadhyay brings with her a wealth of knowledge and passion for literature. She holds an MA and MPhil from the University of Calcutta and a PhD from Jadavpur University on the fascinating subject of children's print culture in colonial Bengal. Her specialization spans romantic poetry, popular literature, children's literature, and childhood studies, colonial Bengal, and the history of travel and travel writing. Beyond teaching, she has contributed extensively to research, including projects on nursery rhymes, colonial representations of Darjeeling, and children's books from Bengal. Her published works such as Our Motherland, Mapping an Identity in Bengali Children's Literature, and Folktales of Hindustan, The Text and Its Times, reflect her deep engagement with literature and culture. I request the panelists and the facilitator to please come to the stage and take over the session. Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you everyone for being here. So let us start with a very basic point which will lead us off into a further discussion. So non-fiction, if I can take the main phrase from this talk, from this session, so we know that it is something to do, it has got something to do with facts. Fact is something that is also considered the opposite of fiction, so non-fiction. So how would you two, you can respond one after the other, relate non-fiction to facts. Of course, obviously, they are not synonymous, but a part of it consists of facts. So, what, in your opinion, would define the very broad outlines of non-fiction?
I mean, I think facts are like the bare bones of nonfiction. And when we say nonfiction, we are actually loading a lot of meaning onto the facts in a manner which actually makes the book worthwhile for a child reader to pick up, not for the facts, but for the fact that the facts should speak to the child in a particular manner, because the facts in today's world are known to everybody. There is nothing special about facts. There is no longer the time where you came to know facts and therefore became knowledgeable. That is no longer the case, because the facts are available at the click of a button through Google or whatever else. It is the treatment of the facts and the presentation of the facts which creates a book of nonfiction which is worth being called a book. And worth being called a children's book is an even greater responsibility, because children are surfing far more than I am. And they have far more access to facts than I did. And therefore, they're not going to be impressed just because I tell them that the sun is very hot or the moon is very far or whatever, you know. It is about the fact that the sun is a source of energy for me to live. That is the idea which might be exciting and engaging, and the treatment of that presentation of that fact, that is what separates non-fiction from fact. I don't know if I answered your question. I'm still recovering from the freezing cold that I was experiencing. My mind is just beginning to operate.
Thanks for that question. I think whenever we talk about facts, there is this expectation that it would be very objective. And I think it's also a debate nowadays in terms of writing history or, you know, talking about factual, stories, bringing in facts in stories. I think it becomes, it would be very naive to believe that, you know, facts, just by being facts, is only objective and not subjective. Because even when, somebody is writing a particular historical episode, there is a particular entry point that they would take depending on their own ideological position, their own interpretation of that particular history. So I think even in telling facts, there is some amount of subjectivity, some amount of personal interpretation that is involved. So while, of course, yes, non-fiction, factuality forms a very important part of non-fiction, to believe that it is only objective truth and nothing else would be, it would be naive, yeah.
Thank you. So yes, since you mentioned history, when we think about history, you know, as opposed to a textbook, which often, you know, as I had it in school, it had a predominantly singular narrative. So I think nonfiction gives us that expanse to open up possibilities of plurality and multiplicity, that there is no one, as you said. So my lens is a subjective lens. It can be also be a personal lens. So if I'm writing a book, then if I make that point that this is my view, but there are other views and other histories. So do you think that nonfiction, and in recent times, would you like to mention some books of history that have brought to the table this kind of plurality and multiplicity?
So I think I'll take my own personal experience in this regard. So a couple of years ago, when I was approached by DK to work on this, they had the idea of writing the timelines of the Indian history, and they entered into the project with the idea that, you know, we wanted to do something more than what the school history books do. And it was very exciting for me because, of course, you know, by then I had engaged more with history. I was thinking more in terms of the lenses through which we interpret history. And my own work with children's literature has been in trying to bring to the fore marginal voices. And I was given the opportunity to talk about these historical names, periods, episodes, which are usually not part of mainstream history. So I think when I was entering into this project, something that perhaps at that point of time I was not really thinking about, but I did have a particular agenda with which I was entering into the project. So I did, now when I look back, I know that I did have my own personal agenda, my own ideology with which I was framing the contents. It's a multimedia book, so the team of designers, the writers, the researchers who were working under me, so we were all working together, so there was a lot of discussion about it. But I think we wanted to focus on certain episodes of history which are left out from mainstream historical textbooks, like say talking about queens whom we hardly talk about, or just talking about movements led by women or lower caste people. So there was a lot of the scope to do that in that particular history book. But I think in terms of other work, I think there is a lot that is happening. There is rewriting of biographies of women from a different lens, which is something I really look forward to. So I think in terms of gender, a lot of work has been happening.
I, of course, completely endorse her view, but I think we also have to remember that every time we create a book, from the larger scheme of things, we are choosing to select something and put it between pages with a spine, right? The moment you put a spine on a book, you're basically selecting something and then confining that particular topic to what you're presenting through that book. I did have the privilege of once working on a book where we took away the spine. And we had an author called Christopher Lloyd, and we did something called a wall book, which he claimed was a history of everything, as much as any one human being can claim that with some fairness, which is a falsehood in itself again. But we did try, we put a timeline at the bottom of the book, which is like a historical timeline from the Big Bang until we finished at Obama at that point in time. And then you sort of went up and you looked at geological history, political history, natural history, astronomical history, whatever was happening in aerospace at any particular point in time. So you could look at the timeline and then choose to go up that section and say that, okay, what was happening here or where or whatever. He, of course, being an Englishman, gave less space to many Asian realities and so on, which we pointed out to him, and we kind of tried to redress that balance. But I think the business of taking cognizance of plurality, I think that is important, and that cannot be addressed by any one book, but it has to kind of address the idea of bibliodiversity. Whenever we are talking about nonfiction, whether it's science or history or social science or whatever, what is the bibliodiversity around a discourse? And how are we presenting that for different ages of children? I think those are the critical factors which determine how a book comes out. So when we're looking at biographies for the very young, you present it in a particular way. When you come to young adult, there is no difference between what an adult would look at and what a young adult would look at, and you would not worry about the amount of information and so on. It is merely the treatment and the calibration of how you release that information which kind of determines what kind of nonfiction it is. So I think having a plurality through bibliodiversity is one way of looking at the possibilities of nonfiction. Yeah.
I think this brings us to the question of also the ethics of representation, because as she was saying, when she was writing a book, she was conscious of having, or later on, you were conscious of having a particular ideology or a lens through which you were writing. And for example, there is this book called Art is a Voice by Art First, where Kripa is talking about, it's mainly a picture book, of course, non-fiction book, and it talks about how art can be made into a tool for protest. And she's doing that with very minimal words and largely through pictures. She is bringing her ideology, and the book actually, it's a wonderful book, and it goes on to talk about many things within that spine. What would your takes be on this matter of ethics of representation, which I think for histories, biographies, when I'm speaking for someone else or writing for someone else, it sometimes can become a question.
So I think the authenticity of voice is what would make that book relevant, and it would be a standout book if there is authenticity of voice. Absolutely, I mean, there cannot be any dispute about the fact that there has to be a maximum representation of as many voices as possible. It should be done in an ethical fashion where you are as close to presenting an alternative viewpoint which has largely been ignored until now. And hopefully if it's done by the people or the communities who have been underrepresented, that would be absolutely the best way to do it. But I think the treatment and the presentation is still key. Because however you represent, like I think Tejasvi was mentioning in the earlier thing, you have to tell a good story. It has to be a coherent, engaging narrative. Otherwise it becomes like ideology in the garb of a book, of a story or whatever. That simply doesn't, it just becomes a boring book. I mean, it has to be an engaging book. So if you're kind of careful in your presentation and you're opening up the space for conversation. For me, literally every non-fiction book should not be like a full stop, that here is some information, facts, etc. and this is it. This is a book about the sun and that's it. Even in a book which is supposed to be almost value-free, which is like presenting a scientific fact, it should be presented in a way that there is space for conversation, especially for the young. When we're looking at the picture book category, if we have picture books where the last page leaves room for a conversation to happen thereafter with the parent, with the child and so on, and the teacher perhaps in the school, where you get a diversity of views on the same subject, or you come at it from different angles. I mean, you can talk about an apple, or you can talk about a tomato, but you can talk about it being made into a chutney or achar, or put in your sabzi or whatever. So I mean, even the tomato has several possibilities. So I think it is really that quality of having engagement which leads to conversation, which according to me as a publisher is critical.
So for me, I think again, I'll draw from my own experiences. I think not non-fiction for children exactly, but because I also translate, and I translate autobiographies of, I've translated so far autobiographies of Dalit writers and Dalit essayists, and so when I work with that something, and it's again there's a limitation here because I had access to the authors, so the framework of collaborative translation worked very well for me, because I realized that me being a non-Dalit person entering into that sort of a discourse, sometimes I do enter with a lot of baggage which I don't realize. And I think that has been very helpful in a much more discursive setup where I have had access to the authors, where I've been pointed out to, maybe concepts that I have mistranslated or words that I have completely mistranslated, because it comes with a lot of responsibility. So I think that has been a key term, but again, I think collaboration does not work all the time because sometimes you might not even have access to those people. So in that sense, I think I agree completely with what Manisha ma'am was saying, that, a sense of responsibility in the writer, but at the same time, because you're telling a story, I think both need to be balanced together very well.
So I was just reminded of the London Jungle Book. So there is this collaboration between Bhaju Shyam and Geeta Wolf, and it is very artily, the book is an art book as well, and it is put together in the, it's not a preface, but at the end there is this section which is by Geeta Wolf, and she there points out her journey in the collaboration and in the process, her role and function in the process, whereas for the main part of the book, Bhajju is the author and his language is art. So I was just reminded of that. Yes, so that is how maybe collaborations can work, and there have been more collaborations along that line lately. So would you have anything to say about travel or travelogue or personal journeys, which in a book form would be a memoir? So I am also reminded of this very lovely book called Abanindranath's House of Stories, which is, I would not call it a simple biography because it is based on Abanindranath's memoirs and builds on it, you know, spins off into a fantasy really. And the book also experiments with formats, because at the end of the book, there are things that the child can do. They learn part of the process or the kind of art that Abanindranath used to make, and there are these little things at the end of the book which they can actually do themselves, like an activity also. So with the format and also with the way it narrates the life or the mind of Abanindranath, I think it is a strange combination of non-fiction and some kind of personal input of a story. So that part of fiction also, because these categories are helpful to start with, but sometimes they also get blurred. Do you agree with that? Would you agree with that?
I think what I have seen in many of these reading sessions that I do with kids, when you have a memoir, while you're, you know, it's a sort of a biography, but it also has a little bit of this personal spaces which are opening up in the story. I have seen that children just get very excited. You know, maybe you're talking about Shukumar's story and they would be like, oh, he did that. You know, they get very perked up. And I absolutely think that, you know, memoirs, especially when it is kind of customized for children, it brings in the space where you can step beyond the boring narration of, you know, facts in some sense and step into a little bit of catching the emotions, which I think as a storyteller when I'm doing sessions, that really works for me, because I've seen children catch on to those emotions very well.
Oh, absolutely. I think in biographies or memoirs, I think it's absolutely the humanization of the figure, not the presentation of this person out there whom I don't know and who looks very big and who's done such great things and worthy things and so on. It's so sort of to establish that human connect, having those anecdotal details about I mean, like I've done books on Gandhi or Kasturba or whatever, where कि उनको नीम खाना अच्छा लगता था और वो सुबह सुबह नीम क्यों खाते थे, oh my God, कैसे वो दिन भर उनका गुजरता था वगैरह. So all the sort of human aspects of a great person, etc. But also in terms of travel, I have found that many photographic books work very well. I had done a series on rivers when I was in Pratham Books, where we had the travel down Narmada, down Ganga, down Kaveri, and so on. And they were all done by well-known photographers who had photographed the river over her moods over many years, perhaps. And we selected photographs, and we had very minimal text, really. But life along each river is just so fascinating and interesting and different in terms of even how the boats look, or the kind of temples which exist on the banks of the different rivers and so on. So if you want to sort of get a slice of how India lives in different ways, if you just have a book on rivers, you can talk about it for days. You know, you can literally think about the sadhu with the many jatas and build stories around what his life must be like. So I think, you know, those kinds of openings exist in lots of photographic books which can be non-fiction. And if you combine it cleverly with art, and you also give the opportunity to children to say that if I had that picture, I would not do that line drawing. I would be doing my line drawing where I would be doing X or Y. I think those kinds of things work well.
Can we also discuss a little bit about technology and how it impacts book publishing in the non-fiction areas, because non-fiction is very open to several kinds of formats. We've already discussed some, so if you would comment on that, please.
Yes, I think you and I spoke about this earlier because we were saying that technology has made the enrichment of non-fiction possible in so many ways, where you can do hyperlinking, you can, just like you were doing for the magazine, when you were talking about if you went to the zine, what would you do? You could do this. I think all those enhancements really work well. And because each child reads the book differently, the possibility that technology offers in creating openings for following your interest, if it's say about automobiles or planes or war or whatever, the kind of technological pathways that open up when you can click on links and go there and then possibly follow that interest further. I think that's quite important, and it's a great enhancement for the reading of non-fiction. Although what AI is going to do to it, I shudder to imagine at the moment, because I have no idea. I am scared of the possibilities that it might open up, but let's be optimistic and hope that it will go well and not the other way.
So what I have noticed is that, again, like coming from the reading sessions that I do with children, we did this, we have been doing a series of writing workshops, and we have, it's been an idea, but it's going to happen in a couple of days at the Foothills Literary Fest. We are going to publish some of the stories which have come out from these writing workshops, and what we are doing is, instead of having only a physical copy, we also have a digital imprint of that entire set of stories. During the reading sessions, or later on, because the attention span of children are now reducing so much, I feel like technology helps in kind of keeping their attention a little bit, but also with students or with children with learning disabilities or with slower reading. I think technology, hyperlinking, going to a video, slipping from words to maybe audio or just visuals, this really helps a lot. I think we have been able to keep their attention for a much longer time than we would do with just like a reading session or making them write. And this is the same thing that we are doing also in the digital imprint of the collection that we are bringing out, where we have, we have links linking up to the images that they have drawn, and it seems like they're all very excited. So it seems like technology can, if used in a particular way, can bring in a lot of change.
I also wanted to just underscore the importance of design and how design is positively impacted by the possibilities of non-fiction, and how non-fiction is enhanced by the cleverness of design, right? It is literally how different non-fiction books look today from the time that I was reading continuous text and so on. And I mean, in fiction, you can have illustrations and all, of course, so on. But I think in non-fiction, with boxes of information, with hyperlinking and so many other things. So I think the role of the illustrator and designer in making a non-fiction experience richer is something that we should really be acknowledging.
So the possibility of gamification is also there. So yes, so it can be designed as a game, and that would, I think, engage children a lot more than this oldish books that we used to read, like encyclopedias.
I remember working with autistic kids, and there are these games which help them understand emotions. It's like, they have to name an emotion, and because there is some level of social awkwardness, trying to break those barriers. Games have done wonders, I think, in those cases.
So if there are any questions or comments, or would they just be like to add anything? Would you like to comment on any other thing that is just there? Or Onurima, would you like to talk a little bit about the books you have?
So maybe I could talk a little bit about Women of India. So this was, again, a multimedia primer, this would be called, I think, in that sense. But I've done 2 of these, and what is the fun bit of it is that you work with a team. So again, because with writing for children, there is a lot of talking down. There's a lot of talking down that happens. I think working in a team democratizes that space, because then I am also getting to hear other people. So what we wanted to do over here was that, and this was also a time when I was a PhD student. I was writing my thesis where I was talking about how women characters in children's literature are not given the kind of agency that, say, a boy character would be given. And when I got a call to write this book, I was like, wow, it happens so rarely that you're talking the talk and you also get the chance to walk the walk. So the prompt that was given to me was that we want to talk about women of India, but also we want to tap into these marginal spaces, voices of women that we don't talk about, break a couple of these stereotypes, talk about consent, and these are things which I'd always wanted to work with. So one of the things that we started off with was, talking about little stereotypes that, boys play sports, girls, play with dolls, and, things like that. There was this another, my special part was when we had to, so initially we had to come up with a list of contents, and this was passed on to the UK team, marketing team. They took a call on, what are the things that they thought should remain, what should not remain, and then, we worked on the rest of the suggestions from them. So we wanted to talk about sexual violence, and we wanted to talk about Nirbhaya, but because this was for 9 to 12-year-old, the marketing team thought that it might be too violent to talk about, and we did not have the language or the images to talk about it. So I said, okay, fine, if we can't talk about rape, then I wanted to talk about good touch and bad touch, at least to talk about consent. And we were trying to brainstorm and think how should we do it. So this is how the spread looks like. And one of my students came to me and said that, why don't you use the character of a cat? And I was like, why a cat? So then she was a cat lover, and she said that if you've noticed, you'll see that, cats have a mind of their own when it comes to touch. They sometimes want petting, but they'll also stop you midway and say, enough, I don't want any more. So you can use that concept. And there was also this beautiful video on consent, which was explained through having of tea. That was there. So we punched both those ideas, and we tried to come up with something like this, which was something, it was a dream come true, because I've always wanted to talk about consent. It's just that I never had the imagination or the space to talk about it. I think Women of India gave me the chance to do that.
Tea, I think, is commonly used as a trope in the schools in England. It's very commonly used. That the tea is being made, and somebody says that I don't want to have the tea now. It's that story, right? Yes, very effective one. And the other books?
So the bit about this, okay. So about this one, so this, when we did, we were very ambitious, and we wanted to bring in episodes from history which we don't include in mainstream historical books, and we wanted to talk about Phulan Devi, we wanted to talk about Kashmir. So we had all of that over here. What I did not anticipate was that the backlash that I would receive after the book was published. Immediately after the book was published, there were a couple of these hate mails that I received on Facebook. People writing to me that, oh, does the government of India know, what you're doing? You're talking about the Mughal period in so much of detail. Why aren't you talking about these southern Indian kingdoms? So I initially being, very idealistic at that point of time, I wanted to engage with them. I wanted them to hear, my point of view of why I was doing what I was doing. But then I spoke to my editors, and they're like, Anurima, this is a never-ending conversation, because it always circled back to the same thing. And I realized that the only way perhaps would be to just ignore it. What has happened recently is that, this was a couple of months ago, when I was alerted to the fact that there have been certain reviews that have been posted on the Amazon, the US Amazon site, where these are both Indian names, and they've written how they feel like this book has been written by somebody who's from the Nehruvian school, who is, from a background like JNU, which is my university. So that kind of became like a, Yeah, yeah. So, and there was a lot of, I think, resentment that was mentioned over there about how I was focusing so much on the Mughal period, which is actually not the case. I think there are, like, from that period of history, we have around 15 spreads, out of which only 5 spreads talk about the Mughal period. So, but there's a lot of focus on that. And again, at the same time, we're thinking with the editorial team if we should get back and engage with these people, but it seemed futile, so we let it be. But yeah, that has been the story behind this book and the follow-up. Yeah.
If Manisha ma'am could talk a little bit, and this is the wrap up, about the editorial intention when, as a publisher, you are ideating a book or commissioning something, then what are your expectations from that book, broadly?
So I think as a commissioning editor, it is largely your awareness of the world that you live in and your political positioning which determines how you pick out what you're going to publish. Thereafter, you kind of automatically try and find authors who will, of course, be factually, correct and be particular about those kinds of things, and with whom you at least have a broad agreement on what you think is, I hate to use this word, but I have to use it, good values for children. It's like it is only in children's publishing where we are constantly aware of the fact that I'm creating something which is going to impart something, which is really pretty hubristic if you think about it, because at the end of the day, each child will take away from it what she wishes to take away. But again, because you're creating a product which will live in perpetuity, perhaps, especially now with digital avatars and so on, you do want to at least have, the broad, humanistic, compassionate values which are furthered in any product that you want to give to the child. So I think as an editor, I would really look for an author who would obviously take care of these kinds of things, and where we are able to find a match. Even if I have an author with whom I am not in complete agreement with, whether it's about politics or anything else. Again, it is the presentation and the ability to create critical reflection about that topic. They may be coming at it from a point of view which is not my own, but does it leave room for discussion? Does it leave room for conversation? What I actually really love amongst authors, if they have it, is a sense of humor, which is sadly a quality which is in short supply in our country, even more so today than it was not very long ago, where, you take yourself so seriously that you think that it is your book which is going to determine what the rest of the children in this country think forever. How absurd is that? What hubris, truly. No single book is going to do that. But if you have a sense of humor, if you are able to have a light touch in how you will introduce a subject, and also encourage discussion which is not going to immediately veer into, 5 slides too many about Mughals. How is that related to the fact that you're trying to do timelines from history? But for certain people, 5 slides for Mughals is way too many. But that's all right. So I think the fact that you can introduce things with a light touch, and you're able to have a sense of humor about what you do and introduce it with a sense of lightness, I think those, as an editor, I would really admire in an author.
So unless there are any questions for the panelists, or Any comment related to non-fiction? We have only discussed the tip of the iceberg. It is a vast, vast area. Pinaki has a question. Yes, please.
Hi, Manisha. I'm Pinaki. So basically, as a designer as well, I'm very interested in certain things. For example, the design of nonfiction. And if you look at it, it's increasingly becoming more and more, I would say, formulaic, right? And since nonfiction do better, and I've seen this, when I get a brief for a nonfiction or a fiction, the marketing, of course, is on you, especially with respect to nonfiction, that you need to do at least have this and that, because there is a bit of a sales angle to it, right? So how do you respond to that? Because I do feel that there is room for improvement. For example, the design of nonfiction in India as it is today. Either it's a photograph or the cover is like it's a typo, but the kind of amazing experimentation that we see outside sometimes, not always, but sometimes, I think is lacking. And also I think the pricing, for example, use of hologram, for example, in a way. Sometimes the price doesn't permit it, right, in the Indian context, and then you feel a bit constricted. So how do you respond to that? I mean, that's a simple question.
I mean, it's a hard question to answer. I'm going to be fatuous in responding. Every time a lost and found Hindi movie succeeds, then we have many Hindi movies about the lost and found brothers who got lost in the Mela, till we get bored of that and then we move to the next formula. So there is a certain laziness in all of us where we will go to the template, or we go to the formula simply because it has succeeded until now. Or when we look at a non-fiction book, we have a certain expectation of how the design is going to look. So if any genre has been around for a bit, perhaps that will happen.
Yeah.
But there is no reason to not break that mold.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a country which has such rich traditions of art, of representation, and this whole distinction between folk art and high art. Why in books can we not break that, and why can we not look at different modes of presentation? As far as pricing is concerned, I think that is a different debate altogether. In a country which is price sensitive, and in a country which doesn't have a reading culture.
Right.
It's always going to be a vexed topic, and I can't give you a single answer which is an answer. It is really, we just sort of respond as we go along to how things are. I mean, maybe we seek hope in the NEP, which looks at the fact that libraries have to be enlivened, or the classroom has to be animated, and so on and so forth. And we understand the importance of having not the textbook, but a multiple set of books which the child can have access to. If there's some level of state subsidy for the production of books, which almost all progressive countries have done in the past at various points in time, which have had very salubrious effects on the population in general and in the standard of education that they receive. When there is some movement on that front, that is, I wish I had a more hopeful answer.
No.
That I can do.